Well,
So
this is the joy of my week because I'm back here with Yvette Miller, the Executive Medical Officer of the Red Cross. And Yvette, thank you for sending me this standing solidarity against racism. And it's so meaningful to actually stand in solidarity with you. And, I believe Black Lives Matter is, the companionship.
yes.
And I wanted to point out what I've got underneath this, which is to live a loving life. Yeah, so that's the foundation of standing in solidarity.
That's right.
Living a loving life.
That's right. It is.
So I am so honored to connect with you. We've been doing, this is, I think, our fourth conversation on healing systemic racism.
At least our fourth.
Yeah.
Because some we didn't record. Yeah, you're right.
Yes, exactly. Yes, we didn't record that. And you nourish my soul. You've become a dear soul sister. I so appreciate you. And I feel that we've done a lot of healing together.
We have.
And so for this conversation, would you like to do a heart lock-in?
Yeah,
to begin
let's
with,
lock in.
and then we can set context for the call.
And then we can set context. So take a deep breath in.
And as Yvette is doing this, sharing this, it's not just for Yvette and I to lock in together. We invite you all to lock in with us.
Absolutely. Absolutely. This invitation for lock in, heart lock in, is for everyone within our sight or earshot or heart shot or within the realm and this of our heart space too. So everybody we are touching, physically, emotionally, mentally, and with our hearts.
Yeah.
So take a deep breath in and blow it out. And inhale in deeper than before. And exhale. And as we continue to breathe in and out, focus your thoughts and intentions on the area around your heart or in the center of your chest area. And just breathe in and breathe out as you focus your attention on the heart area. And as you breathe in and out, think of something, and it can be anything in your life that brings you joy and happiness and favor, and that you appreciate. And just in that moment, as those thoughts, as you have those thoughts, just allow that feeling of gratitude and thankfulness and joy and happiness just wash all over your body. And hold on to that as you breathe in and breathe out. Hold on to that feeling of thankfulness and gratitude and wonder. And as you wrap your body in this thankfulness, I invite you to radiate that joy and wonder and thankfulness and gratefulness to everyone on this call, and again within your heart space and within the world. If you have a wish for the world that you want to share and bring into this space to share in your joy and gratefulness, I invite you to do that, because it's a way of connecting with each other, connecting our joy and love and thankfulness. because as Danny said, that is the basis of respect and solidarity, is when we can love one another as we love ourselves.
Mm.
Right.
So
So thank you.
that's so delicious.
It is, isn't that? Doesn't that feed the soul?
That
That's some gumbo. You know what
American,
that is? That's gumbo. That's love gumbo. That's what that is.
yeah, right on.
Nothing like a bowl of gumbo, let me tell you.
Yeah. So as we transition in that heart space of love, you've got some amazing things happening right now within the American Red Cross.
Yes,
And
I
I
do.
think you will share the scope of the ecosystem within the Red Cross. You have how many employees and how many volunteers?
Well, we have about countrywide, nationwide, we have about 300,000 volunteers, and we have about 20,000 employees.
Right.
So, so the bulk of the work done in the American Red Cross is by volunteers. So that's why they're so valuable, and it's so important for the organization to help meet the needs of volunteers, because they are really how the Red Cross works, and how we provide those services that we provide, in disasters, homelessness, whenever people need help and assistance, the Red Cross is there.
So it's an extraordinary organization, and they've taken a lead on racial disparities.
That's right.
And I understand that over the next, in April, Gail McGovern, who's the president and CEO of the Red Cross, is going to be doing a fireside chat with Dr. Anthony Fauci. And that will be followed by you moderating a panel with the president of the NAACP, Derek Johnson, Dr. Martha Dawson, the president of National Black Nurses Association, and Dr. Elon Shapiro, a member of LULAC, which is a represents Latin American
citizens.
Yeah. Okay. So could you share, more about this unfolding?
So let me just tell you how we got to this space. So first thing, COVID uncovered just for the world the inequitable access and delivery of healthcare to African Americans and communities of color in general. And that, even as this country struggled to just figure out how to treat people, what rose to the top was that even with all of the resources that this country has, still Black and African American people, as well as Latinos and Native Americans, were dying at a significantly more alarming rate. And so out of that, uncovering of the structural racism and bias related to that lack of access and delivery of healthcare, then of course laid on top of that was the killing of George Floyd. So what Gail McGovern did, the president and CEO of Red Cross, is really stepped out in an intentional and heartfelt way to start having conversations around this. And so one of the significant things that was created within the Red Cross was a program to really have these intentional and crucial conversations around race, as well as again, focus on our human resources in terms of bringing more diversity to the organization. And then the last piece of that was, which we will talk about at some point later too, is that in this country, remember, the Red Cross collects 40% of the blood supply in this country. So most of the patients in this country that have sickle cell disease are African American. Over 90% are African American. Second largest population of patients with sickle cell disease is Latinos. And so we have struggled for years to meet the transfusion needs of patients with sickle cell disease. Because sickle cell disease is a genetically acquired disease, and patients who have sickle cell disease are mostly African American. And African Americans, we have some unique red blood cell and Rh antigens associated with our red blood cells, that when you have a patient that requires multiple transfusions, you want to transfuse a unit of blood that is closely matched ethnically with that patient. And so that's why we need increasing numbers of African Americans to donate blood to meet the transfusion needs of patients with sickle cell disease. So the third part of Gail McGovern's program to meet the diversity needs is that we are going to, over the next 4 years, we are devoting financial resources and human resources to increasing the number of African Americans that donate blood to meet the transfusion needs of this sickle cell population.
So there's that dimension, and then there's this dimension of meeting needs. Then there's this dimension of the systemic historic demands that feed the inequities.
Yes, right.
Do you want to share more about that?
I do. So in this conversation that we have started to have, even with the beginning of COVID, regarding the lack of access to healthcare, the conversation has surrounded the mistrust in the African American community of the medical establishment. And so that mistrust is based on the way that African Americans have been treated by the healthcare community basically for the last 400 years.
Yes.
Basically, our healthcare needs don't matter. And so one of the events that occurred within the last 100 years that really is in the collective consciousness of the African American community. Well, there's two things, but the one that is sort of the most often talked about is the Tuskegee syphilis study. And this was a study that began in 1932 that enrolled 399 men who had syphilis, and they were told that they were getting the best health care available. And so, they were overseen by, public health department, public health nurses, and they did get some, basic incentives. They got meals and they got cared for. But even when we identified, the healthcare community identified that penicillin was the very effective treatment for syphilis, a conscious decision was made not to treat these men with penicillin because they wanted to know the natural history of syphilis on the human body. And so this experiment, and that's what we call it, most people in the African American community call it the Tuskegee experiment and not a study. It lasted from 1932 and ended in 1942, so almost 50 years.
Wow.
And even again, after penicillin was...
I just want to track that date. It's, was it 1932 because to 1972? Is that?
Yes,
So that's like unbelievable. It
is. And even though, and you will hear people say to African Americans and in larger conversation, well, that happened over 50 years ago. You all need to get over it. That's basically what the sentiment is. But remember that the past informs the future.
Mm.
And so we keep in our hearts and our minds what happened with the Tuskegee syphilis study, because in 2021, the African American community is still experiencing substandard health care. So it would be something different if 40, that arc of history where, there was the Tuskegee syphilis study, and going forward, African American community was now getting the standard of care in terms of access as well as in terms of delivery of healthcare. That would be different. Then you're right. Then history would only inform us as to what is not now happening. This happened in the past. This is now not happening in the current moment. So you can just sort of forget some things about the Tuskegee syphilis experiment. Well, we can't, because the African American community is still experiencing substandard care now. So as I said, the past is informing the present.
Yes. Yes.
And then just one other thing. So regarding the mistrust conversation that we're having now, which has also been extended to the COVID vaccination and mistrust of that process, what I say when I have this conversation is, it is not the African Americans community responsibility to trust the medical community. It is the medical community's responsibility to show us that you are trustworthy.
Mm, 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 mm,
So when you show us, and I'm a physician, I say it myself. When
mm.
the medical community can show us that they are trustworthy, then we can look back at the past and say, now we can forget that, we can put that into perspective.
So what does that pragmatically look like? What would give you confidence that at least that you're taking, whether it be baby steps or bigger steps, what would give the African American community confidence that we were making progress in this arena?
Okay, so these, again, there have been over numerous studies that have shown that if you compare an African American and a Caucasian with the same assets, the same insurance, the same economic level, the same everything, the African American patient will still not get the same care equivalent to that of a Caucasian. And I just read studies about this last year. So this is not, studies that occurred 20 years ago, or 15 years ago. I mean, there are studies currently done now that show that even with all things being equal, African Americans still do not receive the same care. So, to me, the medical community knows what it has to do to level that playing field. It requires equitable distribution of resources. It requires not just conversation, but intentional action to remove barriers um, to access to care. And almost every aspect of the medical community, there is some known basic standard of care.
Yeah.
So it's the medical community's responsibility to ensure that, knowing what the standard of care is, that everyone that presents for treatment gets that same standard of care. So the medical community knows what to do. It just hasn't done it.
Mm.
And then I have to add, you know, every community has some responsibility as well. We know what our expectation is. The medical community knows what the expectation of the larger community is as to what good medical care and medical care service is. And so we, as the African American community, the communities of color, we have to be informed as well as to what to expect when we go to the doctor's office.
Mm.
And, our expectation has to be at the same level as the delivery of care. That can take time,
Yes.
for people to understand, when I go to the hospital, I can expect this kind of care. For so long, substandard care has been provided to us. So in many cases, we don't even know what the standard of care is because we have
Ah,
always had such substandard care. So it takes the elevation of expectation for the community to know this is what this is what I expect, and this is what I deserve when I go for healthcare.
So
So there's a
there's,
lot of learning to be had. There's a lot of
yes,
learning
there's
to
a
happen.
lot of education. I get that. Oh,
Mhm.
that makes sense. Huh. So can you give us a preview of what you imagine that Gail McGovern will be talking to Dr. Fauci about, and then what you will be moderating in your
Mhm.
panel?
Yes. So, in our outreach and conversation, to Dr. Fauci, we made it clear that we wanted to have the conversation around mistrust in the African American community and how we overcome that so that we can get African Americans and Latinos and people from communities of color to get vaccinated, to understand and inform why it's important for us to get vaccinated. And there is hesitancy out there. Some of that hesitancy is based on that mistrust all the way back to the Tuskegee syphilis study. But there's also mistrust currently because many people understand, and not just medical people, but many lay people understand how long it takes to develop a vaccine, and that we created these vaccines literally in a matter of 6 months. So there's um, some hesitancy to receive a vaccine that we know can take, 18 months to 2 years to create, and we did it in 6 months. Were steps missed or skipped in the development of the vaccine? Are they telling us the truth about the safety profile? And now that we have 3 vaccines on the market, we have the two, and there's differences between the 2 vaccines, the 2 types of vaccines, Moderna and Pfizer are mRNA vaccines, and then the Johnson and Johnson vaccine has to do, involves a viral vector. So there's some real clear information that we are going to ask him to inform us on related to the vaccines. So those questions are going to surround regarding that fireside chat with Dr. Fauci. So when we move to the segment for discussion with the Derek Johnson from NAACP and Dr. Dawson from National Black Nurses Association, and Dr. Shapiro from LULAC, we're going to focus attention on the mistrust and how we go about getting at it from representatives of the community's perspective. And so each one of these organizations that are going to be at the table are organizations that do advocacy for the communities in which they serve. And so these folks are members of the community. So again, they live this experience that we're talking about, this mistrust, they live it. They know how to address it. And so having their specific opinions on how we address it and how we get access to the vaccine is really important. And again, if you've been paying any attention to certainly to news reports, but certainly going to the CDC website, where almost in real time they're keeping up with vaccinations in this country, you can still see that African Americans, Latinos, and folks from other communities of color are lagging behind in terms of vaccination. Part of that is access. Some of that is some of those other things that we describe, vaccine hesitancy and wanting our questions answered before we take that leap to get vaccinated. But certainly a significant part of it, and a huge part of it that needs to be addressed, is still how do our communities get access to the vaccine?
Yeah, yeah. And what are some of the barriers to access?
So, so some of the barriers to access are, in the beginning, it was all you have to go to a website and sign up. And we already know that many people in communities of color just don't have that kind of computer
Yeah,
access. That was the first barrier.
yeah,
Okay. Then the second barrier is that those slots went so fast, and most of them went really, those appointment slots filled up fast because of all the people that had access to the internet, many of which were not African Americans, people of community of color.
right.
So the great majority in the beginning of folks that were vaccinated, I mean, some huge double digit, into the 70s were Caucasian. I
Yeah.
haven't looked at the data in the last few days, but it's a little different now, but not by a whole lot. But so lack of access in terms of appointments, then you could make some phone calls and get on a list, but you were still on waiting lists that were weeks or months out.
Right.
So, and then the other barriers were, remember when we started identifying the phases of vaccination, during COVID, we talked a lot about essential workers and how important that they were. But medical workers, which I think everybody agrees should be first because they're the ones taking care of people. But the folks that we identified as essential workers, they weren't considered essential workers when it was time to get the vaccine. So again, there's still discussion around, how did you come up with this, truly come up with the phases of vaccination? There's conversation around that as well. If people are essential workers, then they should be seen as essential workers and moved, to the relative front lines for getting access to vaccination, because those people that are frontline workers, in any given day on their job, they're exposed to, thousands of people, many of them, for lots of different reasons, not wearing masks, not adhering to the CDC recommendations for distancing and those kinds of things. So those people that are frontline workers, most of whom are from African American community and from communities of color, were really put at risk because they didn't have early access to vaccination.
Mm, mm, mm. Wow. So there's a lot of work to be done. There's a lot of work to be done. Addressing barriers, addressing mistrust, and education all around. As we wrap up our precious time together, would you like to share any closing thoughts in terms of what you feel can be most important in moving the needle at this time?
So what I feel can really bring us together around sort of dealing with the mistrust and moving us all, folks from different walks of life together, is that we have to understand each other's stories.
Yeah.
And so when we just sort of talk about, education, those kinds of things in that sterile kind of way, that doesn't touch people's hearts
Yes.
and bring about that loving spirit that you have to understand another's plight, and another's person's life. And so when we tell the stories of how, in the African American community and communities of color, where a lot of us don't have the opportunity to do social distances because we live in large generational homes, so that so many of us are at risk just in the living conditions that we have. So as we tell those stories of how we live, how we work, how exposed we are, that gets people to understand that hold the resources of vaccination and determining who has access to it, to say, yes, we need to open this up even further. And, I know they're working as hard as they can to make doses of vaccines, but the doses of vaccines that we have, they need to go to the communities of color.
Yes.
No question about it. So it's sharing of the stories that will help us connect and understand where the resources need to go.
And there's an overarching theme in what we've spoken about in our series of conversations. And the overarching theme is, initially you said you can't neuroscience your way out of this thing, and, the cycle of healing ultimately comes back to a heart space. It becomes back to, so I love what you've just shared. It actually, to mobilization doesn't come from here, but it comes from a heart space. So it comes from each of us taking responsibility to engage in an empathic cycle of receiving and giving love with each other. That's the healing space. And I'm very mindful. That's how we've healed, in the cycle of receiving and giving love. So what I'm honoring in what you've just shared, and I'm so, inspired by your answer, because you've brought it back to this heart space. And we opened with a heartlock. We've opened with a heartlock. And I'm going to invite you to close with a heartlock, because it brings it back to that space. And all of these, very pragmatic issues are substantive. They're substantive. They're substantive. And because of that substantiveness, they deserve an appropriate context of empathic understanding. To place it in a place of healing. So it's just a beautiful integration. And, what I'm experiencing is, at this time, is that the power of conscious leadership is only as much as it's connected to an awakened heart. So would you do us the nourishing service of offering a heart-based closing?
Yes, thank you so much, Danny. Again, your words just always just heal me. And so our interaction goes both ways, and it is so healing. So I just get so much appreciation, heartfelt appreciation from you, that it's real and genuine. So let us just close up this beautiful exchange by closing in the heart math space.
Yeah, and for all of you to join us.
And please join all of us. Please join us, all of you, in this space. So again, let's just take a deep breath in and exhale. And breathe in deeper than before. And exhale. And center your thoughts around the area of your heart, or the center of your chest. And as you breathe in and breathe out through this space, think of something that brings you joy and happiness and wholeness, something that's beautiful to you and loving to you. Just allow that wonderful feeling to just wash over your body and put you in a space of love and appreciation and gratefulness. And then I invite you to share, to resonate that love and gratefulness and happiness to all of us and to the world. If you have a wish for the world or for your community, offer that, radiate that love into this space for them. Because love is always the answer, no matter the question.
Amen.
So,
Love is the greatest healing.
thank you. Thank you.
Oh, well, thank you for educating us on so many levels.
Thank you.
It is such a privilege to know you, and to you bless the world with your wisdom, with the wisdom of your mind, heart, and soul. Thank you.
And the wisdom of my ancestors.
Yes.
And the wisdom of my ancestors who help strengthen me every day. So thank you, Danny.
Yeah. I love you, sister.
I love you too, sister. We are in solidarity.
Oh, that gives me joy.
I
Yeah,
know it. Love you so much.
thank you so much. Goodbye.
All right. Bye.